All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to continue our look at our inference paper. Remember, we're just building up those sections. Right now we're working in the analysis section, which we started yesterday with our look at shift, right? And that simply means the relationship of the quartiles to each other. Yeah. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the second part of our analysis. So each one of these is going to get a separate title and then some paragraphs to talk about each one. Again, remember, as you're going to see today, the same four pieces of information are four questions and details are going to occur in each one of these sections. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about spread. And that simply means how far the data is spread out on your graph. And there are a couple of different ways that we're going to measure it. And we're going to talk about both so that you can see why one is better than the other. But you're only going to end up using one in our final paper. Okay? So we're just going to go to Education Perfect because I like the way they write their things. They're very sharp to the point. So that's where we're going to go. Remember, copy and paste is your friend for this paper. Do not get creative. All you have to do is make sure that your context is relating back. So if you copy and paste something about fish and you're writing about dogs, make sure you change fish to dogs, okay? So be careful with that. I would have to get you for something like that if you have the wrong context. So be careful. Okay? So let's just go on to Education Perfect and look at these really quickly. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about analyzing spread. So first, we're going to learn how to identify the range and the IQR for two sample groups. And you've heard those phrases before. Guys, you've heard those phrases before. When you're talking about range, that's simply the maximum number minus what? The minimum number. Range just means how far spread out everything is. So you just subtract those two. We're going to also talk about the interquartile range. Interquartile range means that you're only dealing with that box in the middle that's from the upper quartile to the what? Lower quartile. And so again, just the same process for finding the range. You simply take the upper quartile minus the lower quartile, right? If you do it backwards, you're going to get negative numbers, so you'll know you've done it backwards. We're going to have to provide evidence for your observations. So that little bit of mathematics, the subtraction, that's the evidence. Okay? We're going to relate those to the context of the situation. Tell what it means. You'll be very pleased when you see the description of what it means. It means there is more variability or less variability. Variability just means the difference in the ranges, right? If you have a very, very large range, then the data set is very variable. That means it ranges from small numbers all the way to big numbers. If you have a very small spread or range, then that means the variability is that there's not much variability. Okay? So for you guys, for example, let's say on the last paper, the range was only from high excellence to high merit. That's a very small range, yes? Which means there was very little variability. But say it went from high excellence to not achieved. That's a big range, so there was a lot of variability in the grades. So do you see what that word variability means? Make sure you do, because you're going to mention that word. That is one of the words that I'm going to be looking for specifically in your report. But again, if you just copy and paste what they have, you're going to have the word variability built in. Okay? And finally, you're going to discuss the spread observations in a report, so you're going to learn how to write about this and put those things in your report. Okay? All right, so let's move forward. Okay, so again, spread is just another way of being able to describe what you're seeing in your data, right? And the last one we talked about was shift, and specifically shift in your median values and any significant quartile shifts. So go back and look at that if you haven't already. Go back and pray it and rewrite those. We had some homework there yesterday. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at spread. And one of the measures that we're going to look at is range. Range means the spread for the entire set of data, everything. So range is simply the maximum number minus the minimum number. So if you look at this particular group of weekly number of soda cans produced, you can see that the data is very spread out, all the way from 1 soda can to 14. So to find the range, you just simply subtract the maximum minus the minimum, and we know that the range is 13. So there's a lot of variability here, right? There's 13 different things, different data points between. Okay? So when you look at the range of a sample group, sometimes it can tell you about the variance back in your population. And that's another thing. Be careful when you look at how these are written up. Remember that when we're doing the analysis, we're always talking about our sample, but we always have to relate that back to the population. So make sure you're careful about that. And again, you're going to see the samples of that in just a moment. So here we go. This particular one, we're talking about dimensions of ball bearings. And if you look at bends, the overall range of that is smaller than the range for Beth's. Do you see that? And so if the overall range is smaller, that means there's less variability. Well, if you were making ball bearings, would you want them to be some small, some big? No, you'd want them all to be as close to the same size as possible. So you can see that Ben's has the smallest range, therefore his are more consistent. There's less variability. So if you were going to be talking about this, you would want to buy the ball bearings from this supplier. Yeah? Because this one, you never know you don't know what you're going to get as much, right? So if you were going to pick a superior ones. Going back to that soda cans, so if you look at the ends of the range, if you have an outlier, it's going to pull one of those whiskers really far, either to the right or left. Yes, we've talked about that in the past. But so we frequently ignore range when we're talking about spread because the interquartile range, in other words, from the upper quartile to the lower quartile, is a more stable set of data. The outlier is not going to affect what's happening in the middle as much as it affects what's happening at the end. So although range is one of the measures of spread, and I'm going to tell you now, if you want high excellence, you will talk about the range. It's not necessary, but for high excellence, you will talk about the range. The range is, this shows a lot of variability in this one and more variability in this one. However, because range is affected by outliers, it is not as useful as interquartile range. And again, you're going to see this written up later. But do you see my point there? So make sure, if you want to really get the highest possible marks, you'll mention range even though it's not the one that you want to use. Okay? Now, can you still get an excellence without mentioning it? Absolutely, if everything else on your paper is great. Right? But if you want to pad it a little bit, this is the place. This is one of those few places to do it that I will actually like for you to write more than you need. Okay? All you need to do is talk about interquartile range, but if you talk about the range and why it's bad, or not as good, not really bad, not as good, then that would be a good thing too. So here, all we're going to do is take the upper quartile minus the lower quartile. Do I have to read those from the graph? No, absolutely not. Remember that NZ Grapher is going to give you all of the summary statistics you need to be able to do the math over on the side. You still have to do the subtraction, but you can just read those numbers from the summary. Many times from your data sets, these numbers are going to be difficult to read exactly. So, because they very rarely, like this one's pretty easy because that's obviously a 3, that's obviously a 10. But that's not always not always true about these things. So look to your summary for these. They're very frequently, they're going to be crazy decimals. All right? So here, same thing though, when you're finding the range, you just take the higher one minus the smaller one. Okay? And this gives us an interquartile range of 7. All right. So this little graphic is showing you how an outlier, one single point, can affect the range hugely. But notice that even though that point is moving from 8 all the way up to, or 7 all the way up to 16, while it changes the range, is it having any effect at all on the interquartile range? Absolutely not. And that's why that one is the most stable one, and that's the one we want to use. Okay? But again, mentioning the range is a good thing as well. Okay? But we're going to focus on IQR. So you never have to mention range if you don't want to, but the interquartile range you must. So here we go. We have 2 sets of data. It says the following shows the weights of red snapper caught during the summer and winter. So you're comparing the weights of them during summer and winter. If you just look at, guys, if you just look at this sample, and we want to see which one's more diverse, it looks like winter is more diverse because the overall range of this set of data in the winter is bigger than the range of the set of data in the summer. But if you look at the range of the winter ones, the only reason that this line is so long is this one fish, right? Most of the data is clumped up together here. So is range a very accurate presentation of what's happening for wintertime? No, absolutely not. Now, if you look at the summer, the overall range is not a bad measure because they're pretty evenly spread out. But if you can't talk about range down here, then there's no sense talking about it up there. Instead, what we do is look at the interquartile range. And if you look at the interquartile range in the winter, what do you notice about it? Those 2 boxes. They're very short, right? Okay? And if you look at the top one, you'll notice that that box is longer, isn't it? Well, that tells you just by looking at it, without even having the numbers, although, of course, you're going to have the numbers. Without even having the numbers, I can conclude that there's more variability in summer than there is in winter. Right? Bigger box means more variability. Okay? Good deal. All right, so that's a good example of why you'd want to choose one instead of the other. And here they've simply done the numbers for you. And again, the winter range versus the summer range makes it look as if the winter has more variability. But again, that's just because of that one outlier. When you compare the actual IQRs, then you can see that summer is much more variable than the winter one. Okay? All right. Okay, so that's why we typically use interquartile range to write our report. All right, so you're going to have some homework where you're going to be calculating the range, and make sure you pay attention. This one wants the range, and then others will want the interquartile range. So you can make sure you calculate the correct one. They're not going to give you the number of the summary, but they make them very easy to read what the numbers would be. So let's talk about how we're going to write that up and in our paper. Now that we know how to identify it. So the same exact 4 things that we talked about in the shift section, you're going to make observations. Is there any difference between the IQRs of the 2 sample groups? Okay? Do they have to always have differences? No, you could get data that has the same IQR, couldn't you? It's not likely, but it could happen. You have to give evidence. And your evidence, what is your evidence? Just the numbers, exactly. What is the IQR of one and what's the IQR of the other one? You're going to have to state it in context. This means that the fish in the summer tend to have more variability than the fish in the winter, right? In context, make sure you talk about what you're measuring. And then finally, you go back to your research. Have you noticed that the research is the big difference between this inference paper and the one that we did in year 12? In year 12. I keep trying to demote you guys, sorry. And so in that you didn't have to refer back to your research so much. And anytime you refer back to that research, you must cite your sources. Okay? So let's look at examples. So here we have some data, and clearly there's a difference between these two. First of all, you can talk about shift all you want to. 100% of this data is above 100% of that data, right? So there's a huge shift. But if you look at the variability here, using the interquartile range, you'll see that this one is much more variable than this one. Okay? So you can tell that just by looking at it. But look at the way they write it. The data in the mountain sample group is more spread out than the data in the road sample group. And then they give the why. The IQR for the mountain group is this, the IQ, which is greater. And look, not just greater, but what? How much greater using numbers. That's the difference between excellence and just okay. All right? This means back in the population. Remember, you're working on a sample, but you always refer any conclusions back to the population. This means back in the population, mountain bikers should tend to have more diverse inner tube pressures than road cyclists. More diverse or more variability means the same thing. Okay? These findings are supported by my research. 2 websites I found stated the optimal tire pressure depends on the terrain in which the bike is being used. There are the little citations. Mountain bikers ride over a far more various range of terrains than road cyclists, so I would expect them to have more diverse tire pressure. Okay? Very straightforward. Okay. Now, they also give you this little thing where they're talking about what each piece is. So first there's the observation. One of the groups is more spread out than the other. Then there's the evidence. That's the numbers, right? Then what that means back in the population. And then finally, talking about your research. These little groups that tell you the pieces why are phenomenal. Make use of them, okay? All right, so again, remember that IQR is the one we like to use more because it's more stable, but that does not mean you can't talk about range. It does mean that you don't have to, right? If you have a good, strong paper, then range, who cares? But if you have any doubts at all, then talk about range, but talk about it in the negative, right? Why we would not rely on range. But if you're going to do that, it has to still follow that same pattern. I need the numbers. What is the range? What is the difference between the 2 ranges? And some observation about why the bad thing is happening, right? You have an outlier. You have one whisker that is way longer than the other, right? So some reasoning. So I would avoid it if you can. Just write a good paper and you won't have to worry about it, right? But if you want to mention it, then you're welcome to, right? But don't, remember this. If you mention something in your paper that's optional, I have to grade it as if it's not. I can't go, well, she mentioned range, which is kind of cool, except she screwed it up, right? That's going to hurt you instead of help you. Make sense? So do it at your, I almost said peril. I guess not peril, but you know what I mean. Do it right or don't do it at all. So again, back to those same 4 things. You're going to see this in every section of the analysis. You make your observation. That's just what you see that's happening. Observation means see, right? No numbers there. Then the evidence. That's where you give the actual numbers to support your observation. Then the context. State what that means for the population that you're dealing with. That you always refer back to the population. And then finally, you're going to do a little paragraph, short paragraph, about does your research support your findings, right? Now, is it always going to support your findings? Nope. So you just mentioned, this is contrary to my research, which says that tire pressure should be the same at all time, no matter what, right? Depends on the research you do. Okay? All right. So again, just like last time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an assignment in Education Perfect where you're going to have to do just a little bit of the mathematics so you can get used to that, and then some practice writing some of these out. Okay? All right.